back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. On Tuesday and Wednesday, Yemen's main oil export pipeline was bombed, and this has halted flows of crude oil. The attacks occurred between the central Maarib province and the capital Sana'a, an area that has suffered numerous attacks since 2011. There's been no immediate claim of responsibility, but Yemeni tribesmen often attack oil pipelines and power lines. Al-Qaeda-linked militants have also carried out these kinds of attacks. The attacks coincide with an offensive by the Yemeni government forces in mountainous areas of the south that has led to the capture of the militants' main stronghold in that region. Regional powers have pressed Yemen to curb Islamist insurgents and to restore order in the south to prevent threats to the top oil exporter Saudi Arabia, which neighbours the country. Stability is said to be shaky in the country that 3 years ago took a leaf out of the revolution handbook written by Tunisia. Yemen's President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been in power for more than 3 decades, stepped aside, but peace still seems a long way off. Indeed, last week in London, a high-level forum took place of a group called Friends of Yemen. It followed calls by Yemen to tackle poverty, malnutrition, as well as the security problems that plight the Arab world's poorest country. Half the population have no food security, and there is mounting violence from both Al-Qaeda as well as a separatist movement in the south. The former British Foreign Secretary David Miliband has dubbed Yemen a forgotten crisis. Since the Arab Spring in 2011, Yemen has fallen off the media's radar, but it does have a strong democratic movement. Is Yemen on a credible path to reform? Well, to discuss this and the situation surrounding the country, I'm pleased to be joined in our London studio by Salim Haddad. He is a conflict advisor at Safer World, based here in London. And on the line, we're joined by Jamila Raja, who's a Yemeni political consultant. And also on the line from Sana'a is Peter Salisbury, who's a journalist who specialises in the Middle East. A warm welcome to you all here on The Voice of Russia. Peter, I'll just turn to you first of all. I mean, this latest attack over the last couple of days, this isn't unusual, is it? And the pipeline that was attacked carries crude from the Maarib fields in the centre of the country to the Red Sea. What do we know about these latest attacks?
This attack is one in a series of attacks on pipeline. And speaking to officials in the oil and gas industry, the point is that most people know who's behind them. There are a series of tribes in the area which has been seriously underdeveloped since oil was first produced in Yemen, who feel aggrieved that the profits from oil and gas have not been recycled into the area. There's also political motivation behind the attacks. People in the capital here in Sana'a are looking to derail the political transition that's in process, and for them, hurting the economy. And oil is worth about 70% of all state revenues, if not 80%. Hurting the economy helps to undermine the current government and the current president, Abdurrahman Mansur Hadi.
Now, it's not just oil that has been targeted. I understand gunmen have also attacked electricity lines, and you were saying earlier that Sana'a is in darkness. This has also meant a power outage in some of the country.
Sure, and because of the economic situation here, because of a fuel shortage, people in Sana'a are getting pretty used to 8, 10, 12 hours a day without electricity. At one and the same time in the rest of the country, that is going to be far lower, where people are even connected to electricity. And the attacks on the pipeline are again partly to do with tribesmen trying to raise finance, but also partly politically motivated to build up frustration here in the capital. We've seen a fuel crisis over the last couple of months, which has seen huge queues for fuel and has seen the economy slowing down. And the economy was not in great shape to start with. And now we're seeing increasingly small amounts of electricity on a day-to-day basis, which just really impacts on day-to-day life here in Sana'a. So it's not a great situation right now.
Jamila, from your perspective there in Sana'a as well, I mean, clearly this is an example of the lack of stability which was discussed in particular with the high-level meeting in London from the group, the Friends of Yemen.
Yes, I do believe that all these reactions that are happening in Sana'a and Yemen are in response to the meetings of the Friends of Yemen. Number one, there's a lot of hostility sometimes against the U.S. and other countries in Yemen, especially from Al-Qaeda and some other political parties. or political groups. Number two, this meeting, Friends of Yemen, for the first time created a structure, and this structure is called a security working group. And I think the security working group has made a lot of people angry in Sana'a who do not want to structure the army, who do not want to structure the Ministry of Interior. And I think this is a direct response to what's happening or what happened in Friends of Yemen meeting in London.
And I'll touch on the United States relationship with Yemen a bit later on. But Salim, here in London, there was criticism of the Friends of Yemen event that it wasn't really representing civil society groups within the country. I mean, what do you make of that accusation? Because presumably the Friends of Yemen was set up with the kind of, they've met something like 4 or 5 times since it's been set up. Their motives are relatively noble, one would argue.
I think the Friends of Yemen was never set up to include civil society, and I think it was very clear that it was a government-to-government interaction and relationship. So from that angle, I think the lack of inclusion of civil society isn't very surprising. I think Friends of Yemen is quite noble. However, I think when you dig deeper and when you look at the policies of many Western actors, particularly the US, there is no Yemen policy. There's a Saudi policy and a GCC policy, and Yemen falls within that. And I would say that the Friends of Yemen is part and parcel of the Saudi policy, not the Yemen policy. And in that sense, I would say there is a fear that Western powers in general look to Yemen as a problem that needs to be contained rather than trying to address the underlying root causes. And I think the Friends of Yemen is in danger of doing the exact same thing. But
the Friends of Yemen, when they did meet in London, I mean, the headline figure was that half the population don't have food security, that the country is blighted by poverty. And you did get a feeling that that the humanitarian crisis was the key issue that needed to be addressed. You're saying that actually it's not quite like that, that Yemen is being used as a proxy, as a kind of pawn in the wider game, and in order to keep Saudi Arabia happy.
I think Yemen represents a threat to Saudi Arabia, whether it collapses and becomes a haven for groups like Al-Qaeda who ultimately target the Saudis, or if it succeeds in what the youth tried to do in 2011, which was to create a democratic government. That is also a threat to the Saudis. And I think the US policy at the moment is looking towards Saudi to lead on Yemen. And in that sense, I'm not very positive. I think it is very important to talk and to raise awareness about the humanitarian situation. Like you were saying, half of Yemen's population need humanitarian aid. That amounts to around 15 million people who are reliant on humanitarian assistance. And then when you look at the Friends of Yemen, in 2012, $7.9 billion were pledged, but not much of it was dispersed. I think only about 35% of it was dispersed. So there is a big problem with follow-through. I think the rhetoric is great and the intentions might sound great, but I think the focus needs to be on the follow-through and the implementation.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London, with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the political and humanitarian situation in Yemen with Salim Haddad, Jamila Raja and Peter Salisbury. Jamila, can I get your reaction to that on the point that Salim was making about this Friends of Yemen group as an intergovernmental group looking to appease Saudi Arabia rather than actually dealing with the humanitarian crisis, which is considerable?
To some extent, I do agree with Salim Haddad. We've been under the Saudi politics for now more than 50 years. But at the same time, I would like to point out that there are more problems now that Saudis can deal with in Yemen. For instance, Saudi Arabia in itself now are going through a changing phase or incapability stage. That's why they're not interfering that much in the Yemeni politics. In detail, I mean, but as in general, yes, they do get consulted regarding Yemen by the British and by the Americans, definitely. And they do have a say. At the same time, we have Qatar on the line, on our political influence line now. And Qatar has been trying to play a role since 2011. And apparently, lately, after the attack on the Muslim Brotherhood and all the region, Qatar has been a little bit back and to some in Yemen, I mean. But still, there's this combination between, or this linkage between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis in Yemen, which does not maybe show itself as much in other Arab countries, and it's a little bit confusing for the Saudis because they consider that the Salafis belong to them, and the Salafis are partly funded from Saudi Arabia, while the Muslim Brotherhood are funded by Qatar. Definitely there is a lot of money that has been pledged and has not been dispersed, but at the same time there is a lack of capacity by the Yemeni side to work on that. I would blame both sides on a lot of delay and a lot of not taking it into achievement and not implementing it since 2006, by the way.
But just on this humanitarian point, Peter Salisbury and the countries there that are in the mix here, apart from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, let's not forget that as Arab neighbours, they're incredibly wealthy. Qatar, the wealthiest country in the world, some would say. And if we're dealing with a humanitarian crisis and people not having enough food to eat, I mean, from your view, I mean, what kind of pan-Arab fraternity is there to help their neighbours?
I think part of the problem with Yemen's humanitarian crisis is that it's linked into a much bigger set of structural issues within its economy. The Gulf states have, to a greater or lesser degree, over the past decade, propped Yemen up. So in 2012, after Yemen's uprising, Saudi Arabia gave Yemen somewhere in the region of $3 billion in fuel and in cash to prevent a really huge economic crisis, which would in turn have led to a humanitarian crisis. And the problem from the perspective of the Gulf states is that they see very little return for that they have a sense that Yemen is a very corrupt country. It's seen as being one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and that if they give money to the central government, that it will just go to the wealthiest people. And the second part of the problem is that they want to see a return in terms of political capital. And Yemen, since the end of 2011, has been run by a coalition government of the General People's Congress, which is the party of the former president, Ali Saleh, and a coalition of opposition groups, which is led by Islah, the main Islamist party in Yemen. So even if they try and do business with the government in general and give them money, they don't know who they're buying influence from, and they don't know who will be in government in the future. And unfortunately, a lot of the Gulf states tend to see these things quite strategically. And the third problem is that we're talking about states that are in flux. So you look at Saudi Arabia's internal politics, the two people, Prince Sultan and Prince Nayef, who really dealt with Yemen historically, have died in the last couple of years. Their deaths have left a vacuum. And then we've got Tamim, who took over in Qatar quite recently as the emir of the country. And again, he's dealt with Yemen in the past, but he's got a lot on his plate. So you've got this other issue of countries that are in flux internally, that are fighting with one another, and their focus just isn't on Yemen in many ways, beyond making sure that it doesn't collapse 100%.
Since Ali Abdullah Salah has stepped aside, it's still pretty much the old guard in control. I'm just wondering, when he did step aside after 30 years, what kind of aspirations were there for Yemenis when that happened?
I think when he stepped aside in a political compromise that I think many people in Yemen, especially those who went out into the streets, didn't agree with, which was the GCC initiative. And the reason they didn't agree with that is because they felt that what the GCC initiative did was remove Ali Abdullah Saleh formally from power, but his networks and his patronage systems were still in place. And that was one of the big issues that I think angered a lot of people. And I would say that that's a problem, and that hangover is still being felt today in terms of the patronage networks that he's built and that other powerful figures in the Yemeni political system have built are still there. They're being reconfigured somewhat, but I would say that they're still there and they're still quite strong.
But that GCC initiative made the point that there needs to be a 50-50 division between the old and the new parties. So I guess their perspective was one of, well, we have to accept that he has stepped down and that he and his family or whatever still need to be a part of the new Yemen. Was that a mistake?
The way that I look at Yemen, the way that I understand Yemen, is to try and avoid looking at it too formally through the formal political parties. I think power is dispersed in a number of ways, and formal political parties is just one of them. So yes, there is a coalition government, but I think the way that power has been renegotiated after the transition and during the transition is a lot more complicated than that. And it links back to business interests, military interests, and those cut across the two formal political parties.
Is this being addressed, Jamila, do you think, when Saleh stood down, President Hadi, who was deputy, he insists that the former president is blocking Yemen's attempts to reform himself. He insists that the family is still dominant, still running, of course, the major political party in the country. So it really makes no sense for the international community to try to alleviate the situation unless those key factors are changed, unless the old guard, and let's remember that Yemen is still a very young country, 2/3 of the population are under 25, being run by a bunch of 70-year-olds.
I do agree with you that former President Ali Abdullah Saleh remains to continue to have a lot of influence in Yemen because he's been here for more than 30 years, definitely. He has that depth in each institution, each political group. But at the same time, I do believe that the opposition and the people who the political parties who joined the revolution actually are to be blamed at the same time because they used to be partners with Ali Abdullah Saleh as well. If we take the political party of Islah, a lot of its members had a lot of business deals with President Ali Abdullah Saleh. If you take anybody from any party, with the exception of the Socialist Party. So if you take groups of the tribes people, yes, they are still connected to Ali Abdullah Saleh. And these people are the ones who defected Ali Abdullah Saleh and joined the revolution. So when Abdrabbu comes to power and he's been part of the system himself, it's a culture of politics in Yemen. It's not only that if Ali Abdullah Saleh steps down that we're going to be okay. No, we have a culture that was accumulated through all these years of corruption, of all kinds of political deals that are not supposed to, was hindering the progress of Yemen and progress and the change. So it would be very unfair to expect that Ali Abdullah Saleh would step down and the next moment we will get a better Yemen. Not at all. I do believe even the GCC initiative was a must. Otherwise, situation would have been just like Syria or maybe Egypt or maybe Libya. And in our history, the continuation of these wars are devastating because economy loses, people lose. So without really we were keen on, we want the same people, that were in the politics of Yemen to continue, but at least to have a flavor of change, at least, to start doing some things that are in accordance with the GCC initiative itself. The national dialogue finished, and now we are writing in the constitution, which is a good step. But on the ground, it's something else. On the ground, we're suffering of a lot of killing of the military people, military officers. Everybody takes his right or his grievance into his hand and kills or hurts the other person or the other tribe.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the humanitarian and political situation in Yemen. With me in the studio in London is Salim Haddad, who is a conflict advisor at the Grayston Centre in London. And on the line from Yemen, we have the political analyst Jamila Raja, and also in Sana'a, Peter Salisbury, a journalist and analyst who specialises in the Middle East. I'll turn to Peter Salisbury in Sana'a there. I mean, we're talking about the constitution where quite a lot of proposals have gone to it, more than 1,000, I understand, and it'd be pretty tricky getting some kind of consensus. Salim has expressed doubt over the value of a typical political process in Yemen at the moment. I'm just wondering what kind of hope you would have for a constitution and the idea of perhaps 6 autonomous regions operating. I mean, there's a lot of opposition to that, not least from the secessionist south.
I think the key word here really is implementation. And what we've seen over the last 2 years, since the beginning of 2012, is a political transition which has been based on creating a settlement between two groups, two elite groups that were fighting one another, and then creating a political transition where promises are made for the future in order to try and get people to buy in. But realistically, at the center, very little has changed, apart from the fact that people, as Jamila said, who used to work together, have stopped working together and are now competing with each other. And the big question is whether or not these groups, one, if they keep fighting with each other, will be able to implement anything, or will allow anything to be implemented, and two, whether if it's against their interests, will allow anything to be implemented. And there's no real way of knowing the answer to that. But if we look at the behavior of these groups over the last 2 years, where rather than trying to create positive gains for the country, they have in fact created more dysfunction in government, more dysfunction in the economy, have fought each other, where we've seen a series of assassinations. It really doesn't look particularly positive at this moment in time in terms of the will among these groups, the most powerful groups in Yemen, to allow this system, which is there on paper, to really be made into a political reality.
Salim, we're talking about the kind of rebellions and the insurgencies, and I suppose the barriers that they pose to some kind of consensus in Yemen. But they actually predate the Arab Spring. I mean, the South Yemen insurgency has been going on since 2009, Shia insurgency since 2004. These predate 2011. So within the kind of narrative of the Arab Spring, the problems are sectarian, religious, and deep-rooted.
I think with both the southern issue and the insurgency in the north, with the Houthi insurgency, I think they're very different in a sense that they've come about from their own unique histories. But I think the collection of grievances that both people in the south and those in the north in Sada feel are very much part and parcel of this political system that people went out into the streets against in 2011. So I don't see the protests in Yemen as having started out of nowhere on the back of the protests in Tunis and Egypt in 2011. They were part of a long process of negotiation and struggle in different formats. And so parts of it took the form of the Southern movement, especially in the South, where they have historical grievances to do with the unity of the country. And then in the North, there are more specific reasons related to education, local governance issues, and yes, to some degree, religious and sectarian issues.
And when the US State Department says that corruption is more endemic today than it was before 2011, your point, if I take it right, is that US is to blame for part of that. They've allowed this to fester, and perhaps Washington isn't in a position to criticize corruption in Yemen when they're part of the problem in the first place.
I mean, it's a bit too early for me to say what the US relationship with Yemen after 2011 is, and maybe Jamila or Peter might be able to say something about that. But before 2011, and especially after 2000 and 2001, the US did contribute to financing corrupt systems, including Saleh and his sons, through the support that they provided to the military, to the security sector more broadly. As with a lot of actors, they did play a part. I think it would be a bit naive to blame the US for it all, but I think they definitely played a part in it.
I think that mainly what the U.S. is interested about in Yemen is combating terrorism. That's the number one in its agenda. And I think that was one of the main problems that was there in Yemen and will continue to be there in Yemen, will continue to be here in Yemen. Americans and the British now are the two countries that are supporting Yemen in regard to military and security. But they have now established this new security group, as I said before, structured as Friends of Yemen and approved as Friends of Yemen. And this security working group is supposed to monitor all the money that comes from the U.S. and the British and any other country in regarding to these military and security, and to make sure that this money goes to its destination, its right destination. Number two, that it's transparent. Number three, that this security working group would be established at the presidential office, nowhere else. So I think to some extent, everybody knows now that pouring money to Yemen without really having sustainable 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 agenda. At the same time, do not have any monitoring system on it, and if they do not have transparency conditions, then I think they know they're just losing money without gaining any security assurances.
Is America really focusing on the risk of Yemen being a harbour for terrorists for AQAP rather than concentrating on the humanitarian crisis? Are they seeing Yemen as a place where they can actually have influence in the Arab world because there's other parts of the Arab world that they're losing influence?
Well, I think I agree with both Jamila and Salim when they said that the importance in Yemen, there's going to be no geopolitical gain from having influence in Yemen beyond maintaining stability. But maintaining stability is a product of the anti-terrorism campaign rather than something separate to it. So since 2001, the Americans have claimed to take a holistic approach to combating terrorism and maintaining security in the region, which has been first and foremost about ending the threat of Al-Qaeda, but also creating a context in which Al-Qaeda are less capable of working. So a country in which the government doesn't provide services, doesn't provide security, doesn't provide pretty much anything on a day-to-day basis, where the economy is in decline, and where a group like Al-Qaeda, but also like the Houthis, also like Iraq, the southern separatists, can provide some of these things, or can work on the basis of people's grievances, the fact that people are angry that the government doesn't provide these things for them. That's a context in which the Americans and other Western countries think that Al-Qaeda in particular can thrive. And the point at the moment, when you look at the humanitarian situation, attempts to stabilize the country, and why there is as much focus internationally as there is on Yemen, it's really to do with this question of, one, how do we eradicate Al-Qaeda, but also seeing the wider political stability and economic stability piece as being part of that. So I think the two, rhetorically at least in the minds of many people, many Western policymakers, are inseparable issues. But the reality on the ground, as we've seen in Yemen over the last few weeks, where we've seen sort of this US-supported onslaught against Al-Qaeda in the south while the country teeters on the brink of economic collapse, is that ultimately using hard power against Al-Qaeda will always trump attempts to create in the long term, because it's a much longer term process, economic and political stability in the country.
Salim, just quickly, we're running out of time. Can we see Yemen as a country and as part of the Arab Spring narrative, so-called? Are we expecting too much for a fully functioning democratic state to exist in the near future?
No, and I think I don't think we're expecting too much. I think there was a lot of grassroots mobilization in Yemen, and I think Yemenis have a long history of dialogue that preceded this national dialogue, and so there's this sense also to speak of the national dialogue as if it was something new that was brought to Yemen. Yemenis have a long history in their culture of mediation and dialogue, so I think there is still hope for Yemen. I think one should always have hope. I would also stress that the humanitarian situation at the moment makes it very difficult for a government like the transitional government to succeed in gaining legitimacy from people who are starving, and that is the primary point, and that's where the humanitarian situation, that's why the political situation hinges on addressing the humanitarian crisis.
And Jamila, just finally, the UN Security Council voted back in February to look at putting sanctions on Yemeni politicians. This could happen as soon as June. Will Mr. Salah be on the list? Will that be important? Will that be important to ensure that the old guard isn't part of the new Yemen?
If the security situation does not improve and doesn't look like it's improving, on the contrary, it looks like it's getting worse, I think that they should take action, yes. But if we come to a kind of compromise with President Ali Abdullah Saleh mainly, and he knows what he wants, and he gets what he wants at least, then I think it would be more calmer in Sana'a and Yemen. But I think this kind of deal, I doubt that this kind of deal would ever happen.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much. That's Jamila Raja, a political analyst based in Sana'a. Also on the line from Sana'a was Peter Salisbury, who is an analyst specialising in the Middle East. And here in the studio in London, Salim Haddad, who is a conflict advisor at Safer World here in London. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, at the Voice of Russia in London.